Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second space in our series on U.S. gender ideology law. I'm Ellen Danick. I am co-hosting this space with DIAG, Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender, who is the host. Would you like to say hello?
Hi, all.
And welcome, everyone. We have a number of panelists here tonight. And before we get started with the heart of the space, I'd like to just introduce everyone who's going to be speaking and talk a little bit about the structure that will follow. So we have Sharon Byrne, who's the executive director of the Women's Liberation Front, which is usually on Twitter as WOLF. WOLF works to restore, protect, and advance the rights of women and girls using legal argument, policy advocacy, and public education. Tonight in the space, Sharon is going to talk about how gender ideology gets hidden in blue state bills about abortion, mental health, racism, and about the effects of that, including, unfortunately, men in women's prisons. Second, we have Kara Dansky, who is the president of Women's Declaration International USA, which promotes the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, to which I am also a signatory. That declaration reaffirms women's and girls' sex-based rights and challenges the discrimination we experience from the replacement of the category of sex with that of gender identity. Kara is the author of the new book, The Reckoning, How Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls, and also The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. Kara's going to talk about briefs that WDI has filed, including cases involving women-only spas and sports, and also about the gutting of Title IX and the fallout of that. We also have Erin Friday, who is a California attorney. She heads Protect Kids California, which is the effort to get a measure on the 2024 ballot that would end sex trait modification interventions for minors, men and women's sports, and secret transitions in California schools. Erin's also the lead for Our Duty in the US. She's going to provide an overview of California legislation promoting gender ideology and removing the rights of parents, and she'll discuss where this legislation is headed. Erin will talk about how fringe advocates only disclose part of what a bill contains, how Democrats fall for that, and how to fight for redrafting. I've just gotten a note that my mic is fuzzy. Let me switch over my microphone. Okay, we're going to try one more microphone and see if this works. We also have Unyielding Bicyclist, who's an attorney and the author of the Bad Facts Substack, which covers the gender-affirming care medical scandal, the historical origins of the trans movement, and how trans rights bumps up against the rights of others. UB is a team member at Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. She's going to talk about the forced teaming of the TQ plus with LGB in legislation and the impact of sanctuary state legislation. And then last, we have Amy Souza, who's a psychologist and the author of the Known Heretic Substack. She is a women's rights activist, an educator and facilitator, and her work focuses on embodiment, boundaries, intuition, instincts, and sense perceptions as internal authority-building practices and safeguarding basics. Tonight in the panel, Amy is going to address the manipulation tactics that are used to pass legislation, including empathy traps and outright lies and how to testify effectively. So those are all of our panelists tonight. Let me talk just a little bit about the structure we're going to follow. We'll start with an overview discussion about these primary topic areas, and then we will move forward and talk about legal action and ballot initiatives to push back on legislation that has already passed. We'll do some concluding remarks, and then we'll do Q&A. So to start, let's begin with a discussion about how gender identity ideology is playing out in the law in areas like women's spaces, in sports and prisons, also parental notification, medical interventions on gender distressed kids. I'm being told my mic is still cutting out. I'm going to try one more thing. Okay, let's try this. Anyone who...
You're fine for me.
Oh, okay, good.
Just so you know.
Okay, good. So let's talk about how this is playing out in these primary topic areas. And to start, I'd like to begin with Sharon Byrne from Wolf. So Sharon, hello and welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
So let's talk about how this is playing out in legislation right now, and what you're seeing at Wolf.
So, this is a good question. Very good conversation to have. Various states are trying various different approaches with this, right? And so, one of the things that I want to talk about tonight specifically is some legislation that Wolf co-authored with the Independent Women's Forum, which is called the Women's Bill of Rights. And it defines men and women in the law very specifically so that we have the ability to protect women's sex-based rights. That bill is very active right now. It's passed in quite a few states, and it's super active in like Mississippi, Alabama. It's on Governor Katie Hobbs's desk in Arizona to sign. So I've been watching to see, because today is her last day to veto. So we're watching that bill move. And it is really important. It's also considered, in my opinion, toehold legislation, meaning that now that we've defined men and women in the law, then it is easier to come back and say that we are, pushing for certain rights for women, that, we know specifically which sex we're applying those rights to. So that's one approach. The other approach is what's been very popular in some of the blue states, and I am here in California, and that is what's called shield laws, right? So in my state, we've had a long run with transgender ideology policies, such as putting men into women's prisons, for example, allowing them to self-identify as transgender and then putting them in women's prisons. This weekend, I was protesting down in Chino at the California Institute for Women's Correctional Facility. USC female students organized this protest, and they were protesting the rape of women in custody by prison guards. So it was a great protest. I was really happy. It was in the rain, but was glad to be able to send this message. And this morning, my British turf mama identified an article that had just come out, also about California. This time, a federal corrections facility outside of Oakland. That a judge has ordered to pretty much disperse the female prisoners, somewhere else, because there's such a rape gang going on in there. So I had brought the issue of Senate Bill 132 and allowing men to self-identify as transgender and then access women's prisons. I brought it to my former state senator, who has just been a wonderful women's rights advocate in California for quite some time, passed some really groundbreaking legislation out here. And, her attitude was, well, what does it matter? Because, they're already getting raped by the guards in there. And I said, is this really going to be California's position, that it doesn't matter who's doing the raping as long as women in custody are getting raped by someone? That's the position.
That's astonishing, Sharon. I've had that reaction too, and it's astonishing.
Oh, it broke my heart. I mean, it just absolutely broke my. I was like, I just couldn't believe it. I really was gobsmacked by it. Right, that it was just such an inhuman response. Right, it's such an awful violation of women's human rights, and for that to just be such a cavalier dismissal of, well, they're already getting raped, so what's it matter if we let a few more in to rape them? So that it was really upsetting. I will tell you, I talked to the USC students this weekend, and said, I appreciate you protesting for women's rights, and to not be raped, a basic human right to not be raped in custody. And I explained that Women's Liberation Front, we had filed a lawsuit against the state of California in 2021 for violating women's rights by allowing Senate Bill 132 to pass and putting men into women's prisons. And that, in 2021, the state started putting condoms into women's prisons. Why would women in a custody situation need a condom, right? Like, what would be the need for that?
Seems like an admission that there's a problem.
Right? So the students that I was, talking to said, gosh, that's terrible. And I said, unfortunately, while you may, be supportive of, say a male who's identifying as transgender to identify into a woman's prison, we are seeing a lot of sexual offenders, right, take full advantage of this law because it was written with such a wide berth that you could drive a freaking Mack truck through it. And unfortunately, it's sexual offenders that are saying, oh, yep, today I'm a woman, and identifying themselves and getting themselves into the women's prison. And the USC students had not known that. And they were very upset. They said, gosh, it's awful that men would take advantage of a law like, yeah, that's kind of what they do. So it's really unfortunate. So then the shield laws that have started coming down, my state passed one last year, so did Oregon. Quite a few states actually have done it. So the shield laws force team abortion and transgender rights. That the way to get feminists, in other words, not radical feminists, of course, but the way to get feminists to go along with more transgender things is to force team it with abortion. So what states have been doing is putting those two together and creating these shield laws, saying that basically, like in California, for example, someone can come here to seek abortion care or to get sex change surgery from another state, and they cannot be prosecuted for doing that, even though it is against the law in their home state. They could not be, say, extradited from California for doing that. So those shield laws have been kind of popular. And I will tell you, New Mexico, Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, who were the first two to do it, and Vermont and DC have all passed similar laws, force teaming the ability to seek care in a state by somebody from another state and not be prosecuted for it. That seems, I hate to see forced teaming like that go on, because women's reproductive rights are a rather different issue than sex change surgery, right?
Yeah,
very, very different
they
issue.
absolutely are. And that tactic often, doesn't it, Sharon, often result in the people talking about the bills really only talking about the abortion aspect and not the others? Have you seen that?
That's right. Yeah, and it looks like a maneuver to get some Democrats who might not be great with the idea of let's do sex change surgeries on kids, and or separate them from their parents if their parents won't affirm them. It's a way to kind of get those Democrats to shut up and go along, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody is going to support reproductive rights and abortion. So it's interesting politic, apparatchik, if you will, to get those kind of laws passed. And there have been other transgender laws too that are equally disturbing. The governor vetoed one last year in California that I was surprised he vetoed it, actually, and it was a bill that had already passed in Washington and is, I think, going on in Maine at present, to separate a child from a parent who would not affirm, especially in a custody situation. So if a parent refuses to believe that the child is the opposite sex and refuses to use cross-sex pronouns, then the state could ostensibly step in and remove the child from custody.
Yeah.
And that it passed through our Senate and through our Assembly, and the governor vetoed it. And I believe Maine's had a big kerfluffle about doing a similar bill in their state. So, this is pretty serious stuff, right? You're starting to really see a very draconian hand in enforcing transgender ideology, right? And that is, I think it would have been one thing to say, okay, whatever, if that's what you really want to do to yourself, then so be it. But it's another thing altogether to start really kind of forcing it on people who really want no part of it. And that is what we're seeing more and more states doing. So that's kind of an overview of some of the legislation we see in the process right now.
That's really helpful, Sharon. Thank you. Because, we may have several people who've joined the space who are Democrats who this may be not a subject area that they are deeply familiar with. And so what you just talked about helps provide a good introduction to how these laws influenced by this ideology are not just an extension of equal rights to everyone. So thank you so much. Okay, Erin, I'd like to come over to you to talk about, one of the things I know that you have some expertise on is how to spot the sort of hidden agenda in some of these bills, which often arises with the forced teaming that Sharon was talking about. If you could talk about that a bit in terms of what's going on right now. So over to you, Erin.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And Sharon covered a lot of ground here, but this is how they do it. They glom on to an aspect that is good, that most Democrats would get behind, and then they don't talk about the trans portion of the bill at all. They're completely silent on it. So if I could dovetail with what Sharon was talking about, there was a bill that just passed. Well, it's going through the various committees right now, where there's free menstrual products for women in prison, which we would all cheer, of course, because these women have to negotiate, get, tampons and pads, which really shouldn't be, but it's tied to flavored condoms, and then changing the word from woman to, uterus haver or menstruator.
That's a different
that's
that's just a different aspect of forced teaming, what you're talking about right there.
That's right. And so, as one is just hearing about the bill, and you'll watch the lawmakers who present the bill, and the only thing that they'll talk about is free menstrual products for these women, these incarcerated women, and they will be absolutely silent on the other aspects of the bill. And this is good for the press, because God forbid somebody votes against giving incarcerated women free menstrual products. So this is, the forced teaming again. And they've been doing this for at least 30 years. I tracked it in California.
Wow.
Back 30 years.
Wow.
And it's the same tropes too, by the way. It's suicide, better education, bullying, and they've been doing that for 30 years. And of course, suicide has increased markedly in the last at least decade, and education has decreased also in the last decade, maybe even 2 decades. So none of the stuff works, but they still use the tricks. And then, to find these bills is a little bit of a trick also, because again, they'll put these beautiful names on there, protect children, increased education, these nice euphemistic titles, which you look at and say, oh, this sounds great. Mental health. So there's 3 places where these bills are usually hidden, and that is when it's related to education. It's always the trans bill now, most likely 90%.
That seems to be how it works here in Colorado, for sure.
Yeah, they do it. Education first. Mental health is another one, where they throw in these bills. And so if you're looking for bills, as soon as you see the word mental health, that is a red herring. That's where you start looking at it. And any bills really related to children, you can look at those. And I read everything as, how does this affect trans? Now, there's a bill going forward about books at public libraries. Of course, it's all about the LGBT.
Yeah.
Really, sorry, it's about the T, should I say.
Yeah.
It's about the T. And then if you're, there's certain groups, advocacy groups, that are always behind the trans bills. And, that's our Planned Parenthood, our ACLU, Equity Colorado, Equity, Minnesota, Equity. All of those groups, if you see that they are the supporter of the bill, it's a bad bill, just automatically. And then you'll read it and you'll see part of it's good, but most of it's bad.
Yep, that's really helpful, Erin, because there is a learning curve in trying to figure out how to watch for this legislation in your own individual state, and that guidance, especially about the areas of education, mental health, and kids as being signifiers to look more deeply. That's really useful.
Well, and I cheat. I have to admit, I cheat. I look at other people's websites. I think the Family Council is in 40 different states. The California Family Council is my go-to. I look at what bills they're tracking, and they'll pick up on all the trans bills. Now they'll have religious connotation bills that I'm not paying attention to, but it's my easy way to find out what bad bills are coming up. And then also, if you know who the lawmakers are who are part of the LGBTQ caucus, those are the bills you track to. Anything that they write.
Yeah. you can if you watch for a bit. I'm sure it's harder in a state like California that's so big, like California or New York or Texas, but you start to see that the same people are sponsoring bills in this policy area over and over again.
That's right. And you want to, I mean, we're at a tipping point here, because what the Democrats are brilliant at is incrementalism. So they'll do a small bill that seems like it's not that bad. Okay, so we'll put some tampons in all the bathrooms in high school. And then they'll keep going. Next year they'll do another aspect of it, and another aspect of it, and another aspect of it. So you have to watch for these, what I call sleeper bills, which they seem not a big deal, but they're a big deal because you need to cut them off at the chase.
Yeah. Or it could be a bill that is on a policy area with just one line, one small aspect in a multi-page bill. Here in Colorado, the Foster Care Bill of Rights is headed to the governor for his signature, which is Bill 1017 for any locals here. And it revamps the foster care system, but one of the small little things that's in there is if foster parents don't provide, quote, gender affirming care for children in their household, they can be yanked from care. And unless you were looking for it, you wouldn't see it.
Yeah, and can I comment on that? Because that's a
Please.
huge bill. It is a massive bill. And I'll explain, because once you say that a family cannot foster a child because they are not supporting the trans identity, that is just an umbrella step away from saying no parent can parent their own child if they're not going to support a transgender identity.
It's a very
So
scary aspect of the incrementalism you were talking about, to erode parents' rights, is what it sounds like.
That's ultimately where they want to get to, a place where 12-year-olds can dictate their own medical treatments, and they can leave their family homes, which we already have in California, unfortunately, and some other states.
What a significant erosion of parents' rights.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that overview. As I said, when I was talking about the structure of the space, we'll get to what the after actions are to push back after, in states that already have this legislation like California. So this was a good grounding on that. I'd like to move to the federal level and talk to Kara Dansky about the changes that have been made to Title IX and what kind of effects she's seeing. So Kara, over to you to talk about the impact of the changes to Title IX.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. As Ellen said at the top of the space, I'm the president of Women's Declaration International USA. I need to say that we are a radical feminist, nonpartisan organization that does not support or oppose any individual candidates or parties. And also, speaking solely for myself, I'm a lifelong Democrat, except for a little short period of time when I was a member of the California Green Party. So I'm very happy to see Democrats for an informed approach to gender growing. So I'll give a little bit of context because I just think it's useful to understand where Title IX came from. Title IX was enacted and signed into law in 1972 as part of the Education Amendments of 1972. One of its biggest proponents was a woman, a Democrat, named Patsy Mink. Mink was a Japanese American woman born on a sugar plantation in Hawaii. She was 14 when Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, and her father was arrested and questioned. Although she earned her law degree from the University of Chicago in 1951, she had trouble finding work at a law firm due to rampant race and sex discrimination. But she eventually made her way to the U.S. House of Representatives, where she sponsored the first federal child care bill and bills establishing bilingual education, student loans, special education, and Head Start. She and two other female representatives once protested their own exclusion from the congressional gym. And later on, she participated in a demonstration in support of Anita Hill before the Senate voted to confirm Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And of course, she was the principal author of Title IX. Mink died in 2002, and Congress renamed Title IX the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. And again, I provide all this background because I think it's important to acknowledge the women who paved the way for women's equality in education and otherwise. So many people may not know that Title IX and its implementing regulations explicitly allow schools to maintain single-sex sports and spaces under certain circumstances. Nonetheless, the Biden administration has steadily been eroding their ability to do so since Biden's first day of taking office in 2021. On that day, he signed Executive Order 13988 on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. That order requires federal agencies to redefine sex to include so-called gender identity anywhere federal law uses the word sex. In May of 2021, the Departments of Justice and Education issued guidance documents instructing schools that men and boys who claim to have female, quote, gender identities must be permitted in spaces and sports designed for women and girls. Those guidance documents are on hold in roughly half of US states because the administration failed to comply with federal procedural law in issuing them. There's a case about that I could talk about if you'd like.
Yeah, that would actually be
So
really
in
interesting,
2022,
Kara. Let's
and
add that in, please.
You want me to add that
If you'd
now?
like to, yeah, I think that context would be helpful.
Okay, sure. 20 states, led by the state of Tennessee, sued the Biden administration, the Departments of Justice and Education, and others. But specifically with reference to Title IX, it's the Departments of Justice and Education that apply. So 20 states sued the Biden administration, and they won at the district court level because the administration had failed to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a federal law that federal agencies have to comply with if they want to change their rules and regulations. And the Biden administration just decided they weren't going to do that. They were just going to go ahead and issue the guidance documents. And a federal district judge said, sorry, President Biden, you can't just do that. You have to actually comply with the applicable law. And he issued an order blocking the memos and guidance documents from taking effect in the 20 states that sued. So in those states, the Biden orders and memos obliterating Title IX are not in effect, but they are in effect in other states. It was a good ruling. WDI USA filed an amicus brief in the case, and we were happy to see the judge block the guidance documents in the plaintiff states. But understandably, it has wreaked havoc because half the states don't have those guidance documents and the other half do. So it's pretty much chaos all around the country. That case is on appeal before the Sixth Circuit. So in the meantime, in 2022 and again in 2023, the administration changed course and it actually decided to comply with the rules, and it issued formal proposed Title IX rule changes. Those proposed rule changes have not been made final yet, and most people think that's because the administration knows how deeply unpopular the proposed changes are with the American electorate. The 2022 version would completely redefine sex to include so-called gender identity for all Title IX purposes. The 2023 one is slightly narrower and applies only to athletics. I was on a conference call earlier today with someone who knows a lot about these things, and she was saying she thinks the Biden administration is going to come out with the final rule any day, very quietly, because again, the administration knows that Americans across the political spectrum do not want men and boys to be allowed to pretend that they're women or girls. So, in my view, for the Biden administration to redefine sex to include so-called gender identity under Title IX, thereby erasing women and girls as a sex class in the educational arena, is a gross insult to the memory of Representative Patsy Mink. Okay, do you want me to move on to some court cases or hold off?
Let's hold off on the court cases. We'll get to that when we talk about pushing back on the existing law. That overview was so useful, Kara, and particularly what you said about how they're trying to do this quietly. All of this, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, seems to almost require secrecy because, like you said, most regular people from both parties don't like this.
Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kara. Okay, I'd like to move on to unyielding bicyclist. We talked about the forced teaming in policy of different concepts that for example, protection of abortion access with shield laws for transgender sex trait modification. But UB, I know that you can talk about the forced teaming of the TQ plus in general with LGBT people and how that harms gays and lesbians and why many lesbians and gays want a divorce. So over to you.
So thanks for having me. Thanks for hosting this event tonight. I'm very happy to talk about the subject of forced teaming between gays and lesbians and bisexual people, and then transgender and queer people on the other hand. Just so everybody knows, I am the token homosexual on this panel, so I am allowed to say everything that I'm about to say. First, just to give an overview of what the forced teaming is, I think everybody has an intuitive understanding of what this is because you've all heard the term LGBTQ+, but I'll just give you some examples of how this is showing up in the law. So one type of law is the conversion therapy laws. So they're mostly already in effect in all the blue states, and they're called conversion therapy laws. So this refers to a practice that it was in practice for a while in the 20th century. Everybody knows that it's bad. The practice of a therapist trying to persuade somebody to change their sexual orientation, or kind of pretending that they're able to help the person change their sexual orientation, when in fact sexual orientation is something that is rooted in biology, so it cannot be changed by a therapist. That's just a lie. So, these laws became very popular a couple of decades ago when everybody realized that that sort of therapy would be a scam and probably be harmful to the patient. So that was very popular, but now what you see is that the laws don't just ban it as to a sexual orientation, they also ban it as to gender identity. And of course, gender identity is not analogous to sexual orientation. Like I said, sexual orientation is based in biology. Gender identity is just a vacuous label. Nobody can define it in a way that's not either paradoxical or circular. It's just a person's feeling as to what kind of gender they think they are. So these laws treat them the same way. They do have a carve out as related to gender identity in most places. So they don't totally ban therapists from talking about gender identity, but they definitely muddy the waters. And so they make mental health professionals very nervous that if they even go near the subject of gender identity, then they could lose their license. And again, this is something that was snuck in because conversion therapy is such an unpopular concept when it comes to gays. And people didn't really understand what was going on with transgender, but figured it was just kind of the same thing. So that language just sailed through, and now it's on the books in all these states. And it is frustrating efforts to get real therapy for kids who have been indoctrinated about gender, and now they're confused about it. So that's one example. Another example of forced teaming is the school curriculums and book selection. So, as Democrats, I think that a lot of people here, we all kind of favor kids learning about gay people or homosexuality as long as that's done in an age-appropriate way. And, people are happy for kids to read books such as Heather Has Two Mommies. They're happy to find out that, they're happy to be taught, about the history of the AIDS crisis in history class in high school. That's all popular. But then smuggled in with that are all these kind of trans and queer content. So, for the trans stuff, you get content that is just incorrect. Little kids being taught that they have a gender identity and that it's easy to change sex or whatever it is. And then when they're given the queer content, that stuff is often just really filthy. So that's where you have, books about sex toys or whatever that are in high school libraries. And unfortunately, the movement has been very successful at making liberals think that all these books that conservatives are upset about, that they're all just like Heather Has Two Mommies. And so the much more objectionable content gets squeezed in. And even when parents realize what's going on, a lot of them are kind of inhibited from speaking out about the books that they don't like because they don't want to seem homophobic. They don't want to be lumped in with the people who are opposed to really innocuous, anodyne gay content. So the forced teaming has been very successful there. And a final area where this has occurred is in anti-discrimination law. So again, this happened really in the 90s and 2000s. People became very in favor of protecting gay people. This is an especially interesting area because gays themselves were really tricked by the trans movement. This is something I've written about, where back then, gender identity was a new concept. It wasn't really defined. And you had this propaganda coming from the trans movement saying, hey, gay people, you need gender identity to be added to the law in order for you to get protection, because you are somebody who has, they kind of misdefine gender identity, or they put it in different ways. And back then, the word transgender was very, very loose. It included everybody who kind of, like a woman who has short hair was considered by trans people to be transgender.
Oh, so just
and
gender non-conforming lesbian women could be considered transgender under that idea then?
Yeah, they were encouraged to. So there's articles about women saying I am a transgender lesbian. And in 2024, what that means is you're a man pretending to be a lesbian. But in 1999, that was just some woman like me who had short hair and was like, oh, I don't perfectly conform to some Barbie doll norm. Therefore, I am transgender. Therefore, I should fight for transgender rights, which meant adding gender identity to law. And that was very successful. And now in the blue states, you have all these laws that ban discrimination against gender identity, which is, as we know, very problematic. And so then I think we're going to speak a little bit about how the gay community or gay population receives those laws and receives this tactic of forced teaming. And gays are very, very polarized. So some of the strongest voices on our side of things are gay people. We seem to have a big overrepresentation of gays on DIAG, for example, which is great. But speaking for myself, it's very offensive to see kind of my, I don't know, it's not an identity. It's just my situation be exploited by people who are really hostile to me and my rights. You have these people who think that I should be dating men who think they're women just because of their so-called gender. And that's very offensive to me. And then they're using that to trick all my straight friends into supporting, the guy who thinks he's a lesbian. So it's totally outrageous. And I don't want to belabor that too much, because I think people on this call probably, if you've been in the space a while, you've heard gays like me mouthing off about just how outrageous it is. But I do want to alert people that, on the other hand, there also are gay people who are some of the loudest voices on the other side. And you've probably seen that as well, maybe in your community or just among celebrities, that unfortunately, a lot of gay people are just really into this. We've kind of been targeted by the scam. I just referred to what happened in the 90s where lesbians were told we were transgender. There's been this multi-decade campaign to persuade gay people that they kind of have to stand up for transgender people, that they are jerks if they don't do it. And that's the stick. There's also carrots. You can kind of gain a little clout by being the best trans ally in the room. So gays are very polarized on the issue of forced teaming. Some of us see through it and we're really angry, and then others are gung-ho and they're like, yeah, this is working for me.
And what kind of a reaction do you get as a gender-critical lesbian woman when you say, no, I'm not on board with supporting trans ideology at the expense of my basic rights?
A little bit of drama, depending on the group. I've been kind of lucky. I think the circles I run in are, tend to have a lot of litigators, so they're kind of used to disagreement, or they're not completely scandalized and running to HR, as far as I know. So I've had some good arguments there. I think there's kind of an unspoken anxiety, especially among lesbians, where there's kind of a lot of internalized homophobia where we don't like to be called man-haters. That really got to us when we were teenagers. And I think as adults, in 2024, what that translates to is I don't want to be a TERF. I don't want to be seen as afraid of so-called women with penises. Yeah. And so I think it's a little bit triggering when somebody like me is like, oh, I'm a TERF and I'm not going to date that guy. And it's like, oh my God, you're blowing our cover and you're going to get us made fun of again. Stop it, stop it, stop it.
Yeah, that's helpful perspective. Thank you, UB. I appreciate that. I'd like to go to now our final panelist, Amy Souza. So, Amy, welcome. We've talked about how so much of the theme in this legislation, as well as just the social aspects, revolves around saying one thing and doing another. And I know that you have some things to talk about the tactics and the manipulation used to pass this legislation, and also how people can prepare to push back. So over to you, Amy.
Yay, thank you. I'm so glad you all are have started DIAG and are holding these spaces. I think all of your spaces have been incredible so far, so thank you for having me. I think this whole ideology is a linguistic manipulation at heart. They're all human beings are men or women. So really the entire notion of trans as sort of a new kind of person, or a person who is something other than their sex, is at heart already a manipulation, a language, a trick, a sleight of hand. But there is, in a lot of these laws and all of the language sort of surrounding these laws, in terms of how they are publicized, how they are pushed, how they are spoken about in the media, there's a lot of linguistic tactics at play. We have already spoken a lot about the forced teaming. That is one tactic. There is also the forced positivity in terms of affirmation and validation, that these identities require these things, that this requires our, quote, kindness. We just need to be kind. So I think that it's important to remember, in that example, we need to reserve our kindness, for example, for kids, and our kids' ability to stay grounded in their bodies, to be able to trust their bodies to tell them the truth about the world. We see these kind of thought terminating mantras, and these are also used very specifically to sort of stop us from going into further cognitive analysis, from using that analytical part of our brain. When we hear trans rights are human rights, and that's repeated ad infinitum, by the UN and Amnesty International, when we hear trans women are women, when we hear protect trans kids, all of these things are used to stop us from, one, trusting our instincts, and from two, going into a deeper analysis about what these phrases mean. Then, of course, there's the minimizing language, top surgery, bottom surgery, gender affirming care. This minimizes the actual harm that we're seeing. We don't say, kids are getting radical double mastectomies or breast amputations. We call that a top surgery. You don't say kids are getting genital mutilations. We say they're getting bottom surgery. So all of these little linguistic tricks are used to stop us from really thinking about what's happening, and also to stop us from being accurately able to address what's happening. So if we start using their language, we are already inhibited from accurately speaking about what's going on. And I do think a lot of times, I'll get into this more in a minute, but what happens when people testify is they try to use the language of the bills, which, if you stay in their language, you're automatically, as I just said, inhibited from being able to address what is actually happening. And all of these things combined, all of these little tactics that I laid out, the minimizing language, the forced positivity, the forced teaming, the repetitive thought terminating mantras, all of these work to be an empathy trap. And a lot of what an empathy trap is, before I go into the next thing, but what an empathy trap is, it's a way to derail our empathy. So, a lot of Democrats are very classic liberals. They have a value set of live and let live. They also have a value set of having been through, the AIDS crisis, and having fought for gay marriage, and, really being a part of all of these liberal causes. And, so many people who are involved in this are going to have a natural empathy, especially in that remembrance of gay rights. This is something that will evoke people's empathy. And we also see it in the language in these laws, with how they're framed. We don't want to ban kids from sports. We want to provide trans kids with health care, so this is preying on an empathy. Now, our natural empathetic response should be to stop kids from being harmed. For example, stopping them from genital mutilation. Our natural empathy should be for girls to have fair sports. There are natural empathies. So these empathy traps are a way to derail us from seeing what is actually in front of us, and to go along with these language manipulations. So when we're, actually doing the testifying, when we're standing up, whether you are in front of a school board, whether you are in front of your city council, state's council, or federal legislature, it's very important to not go along with these linguistic ploys. The person who is empathetic, they're naturally going to be the enemy of the sociopath. But if we allow our empathy to be derailed by these manipulations, we won't be able to see it. So when it comes to things like, trans kids are being banned from sports, it's important when we stand up to say, no one is being banned. All boys, regardless of their non-conformance with sex stereotypes, regardless of what their identity claims are still very welcome to play on boys' teams. To call out the manipulation happening in how the bill is framed. Gender affirming care or healthcare. Everyone is still, has access to healthcare. Everyone has the same human right to healthcare. Just because we do not want kids to have their puberty blocked, or to be on wrong sex hormones, or to have their breasts amputated or genitals mutilated, does not mean that kids are being denied healthcare. All kids are still being allowed access to healthcare. So I think it's. Oh, go ahead. We're going to say something.
I was just going to ask you a follow-up question, Amy. I didn't mean to cut you
go
off.
Ahead.
But in addition to thinking about how the language that you use makes you come across when you're testifying, I wondered, is it possible that when you are a citizen trying to testify against legislation like this, if you're caught up in trying to figure out how am I supposed to refer to this man who thinks he's a woman, but he looks like a man, and I don't know which pronoun to use, do you think that makes it just harder for you to testify accurately about the substance, like leaving aside how it comes across to the people in the room? Like, do you think that causes some discord inside your brain that you're worrying about the wrong thing?
Yeah, and I think people, again, I think it absolutely, if you're trying to be caught up in their language, there's a dissonance. There's a cognitive disruption of having to translate in your own head. Like if we're talking about men in women's prisons, it makes it really clear if you're talking about the issue to say, I don't want men in women's prisons, or men are raping women in women's prisons. But if I have to do this little translation in my head, like every time I want to say man, I have to translate it into trans woman, that's a little disruption. So it disrupts our own ability to stay grounded in reality. And it also obscures what we're talking about. Kara was talking about Title IX. That is a sex-based issue. So, and a lot of these issues, men in women's prisons, men and boys in women and girls sports, this is a sex-based issue. So to use their language also obscures sexism, and so there's been a lot of good propaganda around transphobia and bigotry, and I think there are a lot of good people who don't want to be seen as phobic of anyone, and I will often just say, like, I don't hate any men or women. I don't hate any men or women regardless of how they identify. It's just that I don't recognize this ideology. I continue to speak about men and women in terms of, their humanity, in terms of their role in the reproductive process, just like I would talk about any animal is their role in the reproductive process, a cow or a bull. I wouldn't try to obscure those words. So to identify sexism and sexism when it's happening in law, I cannot participate in any obscuring of sex. How can I fight sexism if I am actively allowing sex to be obscured when I talk about it?
Yep, that's helpful, Amy. Thank you. Thank you so much. So that was a good overview of what's been going on and what is happening and the motivations and techniques behind that. I'd like to move forward with the panel to the next topic area, which is, okay, we've got legislation that I think we all think is bad that's been passed, and what are the things that are going on to push back on that? And that includes legal action, both lawsuits as well as briefs being filed in support of lawsuits, ballot initiatives, and some other things. And so I think, Sharon, I started with you before. I think I'm going to come back to you to start about, give us a grounding of, how do you How do you educate fellow Democrats about the effects of this kind of legislation? What kind of polling numbers have you seen about what Democrats think about it? And then when they become moved to action, once they realize what's been going on with the laws in their state. So over to you, Sharon.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'm going to follow Kara's lead here. And just for the record, Women's Liberation Front is a nonpartisan organization. I would tell you, though, that a lot of the women that show up looking for us and wanting to connect with us are very upset Democratic women who are like, what happened to my party? I thought they used to care about my rights, right? I thought that they were the party for women. So that tends to be the vast majority of our supporters and sisters in action. But we are nonpartisan. We work in nonpartisan fashion. So a few things. One is, when you're talking to folks, and I just had this experience this weekend with some students from USC, and it's great to have this engagement. They were using the very, inclusive terms and trying to be very politically correct. And I really appreciated that. But when I pointed out to them that the way the California law was written around prisons in particular, right, with allowing transgender identified males to get into women's prisons, said, you do understand that because that law was written so broadly, it is allowing just regular rapists sitting in a men's prison to go, hey, that's for me. I'm going to go ahead and self-identify. And I should tell you about the California law, too, that it's basically written so that the prison can't turn them down. They get like 6 appeals. And on the 6th appeal, they're going to get through. So the state is an extremely heavy-handed player in the oppression of women and the erasure of women's rights. And I think that's something important to note, is that we've moved beyond a place where let's all be tolerant, let's try to make room, for this sort of newly invented species of human that wants to proclaim itself marginalized. We've moved beyond that to an extremely authoritarian stance now, where we are repressing women's rights in order to advance this sort of people. I've heard it termed as trans supremacy, and that's a fair description of it. So sometimes when you're talking, we also had a conversation with an abortion clinic in a state that we were looking to do some work in. And, when they said, our pronouns or whatever, we all kind of just paused. There was this very pregnant pause in the conversation. And we said, look, just on the record, we're full-throated supporters of reproductive rights. We will go to the mat to protect women's reproductive rights. But we are not good with erasing women, and we are not good with terminology or language that does that. And so we have an issue with that. And so the women from the abortion clinic, there was another pregnant pause. And then they came back and they said, they've asked us to take the word woman out of our name, and we don't know how to deal with that, because all we do is women's healthcare, women's reproductive healthcare. What the hell are we if not, for women, right? So I've noticed that, first of all, if you can have these conversations in kind of a calm way and sort of introduce folks to the parts of the concept that they might not have gotten before, that it's one thing to be tolerant. I would totally be an advocate all day long for tolerance and open-mindedness. It's another thing to erase somebody else's rights in the process. And I am an international human rights consultant, and I will tell you, this is the first time in human rights history, in the history of all there is around human rights, that we have ever decided to take rights away from one marginalized group and hand them to another. It's not been done, right? That is just not how human rights work is done. So this is a very new animal on the field. I guess I would point that out first. So when you're having conversations, try to not lock and load as much as listen thoughtfully, open yourself up for a little improv work, and be able to say, did you think about this part, right? Because that just like the USC students were shocked that men would take advantage of that law and transfer into women's prisons so they could have free access to a whole new slew of rape victims, right? They just hadn't thought of it that way, right? So sometimes it's just opening up that way. Now, when you're talking about the Women's Bill of Rights, right, that we've been introducing, we find Republicans love to take up that bill. And, this is them being great opportunists. Let's, call a spade a spade.
Politics is transactional. No matter what else is true, politics is transactional.
Well, absolutely. And if you're a hard-lining Republican guy that's busy, banning abortion, don't you feel really good about yourself, pat yourself on the back for passing the Women's Bill of Rights? So in that regard, I think we've achieved great branding. It's not really a Bill of Rights in terms of granting women additional rights. What it does do is clarify the terms men and women in the law, and boys and girls, right? And that is important for women's rights, because when we talk about sex-based rights, it's really important to know who they apply to and prior to what, about 7 years ago, we all knew who they applied to, but now it's all become very questionable. Now, I want to say there are some Democrats that are speaking up and they are doing the right thing. And when they are doing the right thing, we need to give them all the air cover that we can, right? I mean, anytime a politician.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to name a couple, right? So Sean Theory out of Texas. She's a legislator out of Houston. And she stood with some Republicans who passed legislation in Texas to really stop sex change procedures on minors. It was really reasonable. It was not draconian at all. It was quite protective. And of course, she's been thoroughly vilified, but it was very brave to do that. Jonah Wheeler gave an impassioned speech in New Hampshire when opening up that way. Now, when you're talking about the Women's Bill of Rights, right, that we've been introducing, yeah, we find Republicans love to take up that bill. And, this is them being great opportunists. Let's, call a spade a spade.
Politics is transactional. No matter what else is true, politics is transactional.
Well, absolutely. And if you're a hard-lining Republican guy that's busy, banning abortion, don't you feel really good about yourself, patting yourself on the back for passing the Women's Bill of Rights? So in that regard, I think we've achieved great branding. It's not really a Bill of Rights in terms of granting women additional rights. What it does do is clarify the terms men and women in the law and boys and girls, right? And that is important for women's rights because when we talk about sex-based rights, it's really important to know who they apply to. And prior to what, about 7 years ago, we all knew who they applied to, but now it's all become very questionable. Now, I want to say there are some Democrats that are speaking up and they are doing the right thing. And when they are doing the right thing, we need to give them all the air cover that we can, right? I mean, anytime a politician.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to name a couple, right? So Sean Theory out of Texas. She's a legislator out of Houston. And she stood with some Republicans who passed legislation in Texas to really stop sex change procedures on minors. It was really reasonable. It was not draconian at all. It was quite protective. And of course, she's been thoroughly vilified, but it was very brave to do that. Jonah Wheeler gave an impassioned speech in New Hampshire when they passed the similar bill, right? And he took it on the chin, right, in the press for doing that. So, when we have seen more of this in the UK, that we are seeing certain leaders from Scottish National Party like Joanna Cherry and others that are standing up and really, and Rosie Duffield from Labour, that when they stand up and they speak, they get vilified, but they are doing the right thing. And we want to really encourage them to continue to do the right thing. And the way to do that is to call them up and say, wow, I was brave and I appreciate it. And I really, thank you for supporting this. It's very important that you did. So I think that's important too, is to make sure that, I think one of the things that Democrats are very afraid of is being fired upon as transphobic, right? And that is.
Yeah, because it happens and it's loud. Even if it's a small group of people, they're really, really loud.
Yeah, but just like Bicyclist was saying earlier, unyielding bicyclist, and I thoroughly agree with her. One of the things that has been leveraged very successfully against gays and lesbians in this fight is by telling them that their mere sexual orientation is now transphobic. Now, that's a homophobic statement. And at once upon a time, we used to think homophobia was a terrible thing. Now it's thrown about freely, dressed up in sparkles and rainbows as in a new form. So I think it's really important, for people who feel like their rights are being violated to be able to speak freely and not be exiled to the far right, right? I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to have dissension in leftist ranks. And it doesn't mean we all signed up for Republican Party membership, right? It just means we're not really in agreement.
That is correct. We're not all going to we're not all becoming Christian nationalists just because we don't want men in women's prisons.
Exactly. So we can have disagreements, and dissension is healthy, right? It gets us to better places to have some discussions about where things are not going well. So I really feel like it's important that when you find Democrats who are questioning, when you find anyone really, but if you find Democrats who are questioning, if you find legislators who are like, man, this is just a bridge too far, and when we're talking about, doing sex change operations on kids, this is a bridge too far. Any ideology that demands children as sacrifices has gone too far. So I think it's fair to turn around and stand up for that, and to encourage other Democrats to stand up for it. And again, be open-minded and open to improv and welcoming and tolerant. Just say, but did you think about this? And sometimes it really will wake folks up.
Yeah, that's helpful. And it's especially helpful, Sharon, that when you're asking those questions, you've given the example a couple of times about men and women's prisons. That's a such an arena where it throws into high relief the fact that so much of this ideology relies on privileging the feelings of a few men over very real harm to women and children.
1000%. You know, sometimes at Wolf, we say that this is the best men's rights movement ever designed, and we would have never seen it coming from this flank, right? Just
Yep.
never.
And I know Kara wrote about that in The Abolition of Sex, that, you know, this is a men's rights movement that other movements that had similar goals could only envy the success of.
I know, but it's all sparkly and rainbowed now, see? So we didn't
Yeah.
recognize it as the new patriarchy, right? It's
That's,
really the old patriarchy.
that's right. It got dressed up in sparkles and feathers and just fooled us all. Okay, well, good. Well, Sharon, is there anything else you want to say before I move on?
No, go ahead, keep going.
Okay, thank you. Erin, I'm going to come back to you to talk about pushing back specifically, although not exclusively, via ballot initiatives, because you are an expert on that. So over to you.
I would hardly say that I'm an expert. I would say I'm a novice in a massive undertaking that I really had no idea how difficult it is to do a ballot initiative. But it to me, it seems the only way for some of the deepest blue states to make a dent in gender ideology. Because even here in California, our Republicans who are in office, they are wusses. They look away, they look down when we come and testify, or they nod at us and then they don't vote, or they get up and walk out when it's time to vote because they also don't want to be cast as transphobic. We'll have private conversations, but
Will they express
it's or
support in those private conversations privately, Erin?
they do, but then they give their excuses of why they can't speak up.
And that's so
And so
familiar.
yeah, and and it's all cowardice. I mean, we know this. It's all cowardice. Most people who are on this call hopefully have, and I don't even call it bravery because bravery is a misnomer. You have to be scared. I'm not scared, and none of us should be scared. We should be more frightened of our rights being torn away, and as um, Amy was talking about language. Language is a bigger issue than just transphobia. It's First Amendment. And so when we are giving up our First Amendment rights, we are giving up our democracy. And so that's a frightening
And it's a
act.
traditional value of the Democratic Party, is the idea that you can dissent and speak freely and not be compelled to profess beliefs you don't hold.
Absolutely. Remember the old ACLU, the
Oh,
one that we probably wrote checks to.
yeah, nostalgia.
Yeah, they have all but disappeared. But the ballot initiative, is a massive undertaking. I know you're doing it in Colorado. I believe Illinois is doing one, and then Washington State did one. And what the ballot initiative does too, so importantly, even if we don't get on the ballot, even if you don't get on the ballot, is it is a massive education tool. So I was one of those Democrats prior to my daughter taking on a trans identity who was just living my life, reading the New York Times, listening to NPR, reading The Atlantic. I didn't even know the trans agenda was underway.
Do you pine for those
Because
days when you could just be a normal person?
I do, because now I kind of like, I see trans people everywhere. Like everywhere I look. It's but it's in. I know it's funny. Our buses are papered with it. In my neighborhood, we have a trans store.
I believe
I'm,
it.
I'm not kidding. And so you can't actually, once you see, you never stop seeing. So yeah. So here in California, what this undertaking has done, which has been a massive learning curve, but also an amazing journey, and we're not done. I mean, we have until May 15th to get our signatures in, and we have a trial on Friday, which could extend our time. But what we're doing is we're going for the big cojones here. We're going for everything. We are stopping all gender interventions on minors, no puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries. We are getting all boys out of girls' sports, even in the collegiate level, out of bathrooms, accommodations, and we are stopping schools from these covert, secret social transitions, and then doing any type of lifting of that gender identity by giving out, binders or trans tape or other materials. So it's the big one. And the importance of this can't be understated because, or can't be overstated, sorry, is because the governor's watching us.
Yeah.
I mean, when you know that the governor is watching you, that's a pretty amazing thing for one, for 5 mad parents. That's what it took, 5 mad parents to file this thing.
Yeah, but if there's
And some
enough
money.
mad, 5 parents is a lot.
Well, that's what I want to get to, because everyone and anyone can move the ball forward. You think that what you're doing doesn't have a ripple effect, and it does. Every phone call someone makes to their lawmaker has an effect. You may not see it immediately, and it costs you nothing. It costs you nothing to call and berate them. I think Sharon talked about the bill that was stopped last year. It was vetoed by Governor Newsom. It was vetoed because Californians kept calling his office. That's how it was done. It wasn't done because he had misgivings about the bill. He wanted to pass the bill. He just got caught with his pants down. And we came out with pitchforks.
Yeah, you didn't appeal to his better nature. You appealed to his sense of fear, Erin.
That's right. That's right. Because that's what they actually need to feel afraid of us, that we are powerful. And the only way you can show that you are powerful is you show up and you stand up and you are fearless when you are testifying, and you never capitulate. You never take their language, ever. Not even a little bit, not in being kindness. You stand tall and you make a name for yourself. And oddly, I mean, I've had some now Democrats talk to me in private for a long time about the transgender movement, and they know that it's wrong. They don't know how to get out from under it. I've had Republicans ask for me to endorse them, a Democrat. It's a very odd world.
It is. It brings some strange, I see this in Colorado in the legislature here, it brings some strange alliances because politics is transactional.
Well, I'll tell you, and we shouldn't be afraid as Democrats. We should not be afraid of the Republicans. We're not handing them a win. And I'm talking about the grassroots Republicans, those of us who are like us, of holding hands with them to get this done. The way this movement got legs was that it made us team A and team B, and it siloed us, and it made sure that we never spoke, and that you only followed liberal newspapers, or you followed right-wing publications, and that's it. And that's how we got here, because the 80% of Americans, we all agree on the same thing.
Yeah, and when you're talking about standing firm and standing tall and testifying, knowing that has to help, doesn't it? Knowing that you're speaking for the 80% of the population that knows this is harmful, if they're aware of it.
Absolutely. And then I want to just end with one more comment about the ballot initiative, because in Washington State, they did a ballot initiative. And oddly, the legislature didn't want to give them a win. And so they passed a parental notification bill. That was part of the ballot initiative. So they wanted to take it. Now they wanted to, make it probably less stringent than what the ballot initiative is. But the politicians truly want to just stay in office, and they want to get money, but they want to stay in office. So if they start seeing a shift, they go whichever way the wind blows. We've got to be the ones telling them of the shift. And I have to thank Wolf, because Man, what a wonderful thing they did. Sharon, with the SPRY polling, is they paid for polling in the state of California that showed the vast majority of Californians are against all of this.
Yeah, which is powerful because that's so much more, it's so much meatier than just anecdotal evidence. I mean, if you get enough anecdotes, eventually you do have data, but polling data, that's powerful.
It is. And then you take it to your lawmakers and say, look, the data doesn't lie. You're going in the wrong direction. Do you want to stay in office? And you can also back them in a corner. I just did this recently. It's kind of fun. I took excerpts from a very pornographic kids book and I sent it to all the lawmakers on the education committee. And I said, respond within 48 hours whether you think this book is appropriate for children, for students.
It's pretty hard for them
And
to
when
come
they
back
don't,
and call you a church lady who wants to ban books when you've sent them the actual material.
that's right. That's right. And you stay away from the, obviously, I have two mommies. I mean, there's enough out there to really show some nasty stuff. And then you hold their feet to the fire. You keep raising that as an issue. You're okay with this book that tells young kids to go on Grindr? Are you okay with this book? And you just don't let up.
That is one of the sort of secret things about engaging with any sort of government, whether it's local, at school board level, or legislatively. If you're not afraid of confrontation, you have an upper hand, which I think is exactly what you've been describing, Erin. Any last thoughts before I move on from you?
Well, just another thing. We all are nervous every time we speak. It
Boy,
still
that's
doesn't
true.
matter. I mean, my heart is still pounding, even though I can have my script and be, super prepared. And I know these jerks that I'm testifying in front of, and I always get nervous. But who cares? You do it anyway. You do it anyway because if we continue to stay silent, if we continue to be complicit, it's only going to get worse. We see it. Title IX is disappearing. They are changing every code in California to erase the word woman. Every single code section, little by little by little.
Yeah, it can be daunting to try to track that and figure out where to engage. But if you know that you're representing the majority of people who when they become aware of this on both sides, including the Democrats, believe that it is harmful and a bad idea, that's got to help. One more question I actually have for you before we move on is, separate from legislation, is there anything specifically about school policy engagement that you would like to say about how to be effective there in pushing back? Because I know you have some expertise there.
Sure. So again, with the schools, there's the school board meetings, and you push and you push and you just continue to show up. The other thing is we've got a lot of tools, and requests for public records is an incredible tool that
Great.
anyone can employ. And the great part about it, and this is probably in all 50 states, is that the government entity that you're asking the documents from usually statutorily need to assist you. So if you don't write it artfully, they still need to help you. And the other wonderful thing, most statutes give you your attorney's fees if they do not give you the documents. And there are a lot of attorneys who take these cases because they're easy to win. They're very easy to win. Did they give you the documents? No. And they don't want to share these documents with you. And once you get those documents, then you get louder.
That
Because
is
they've been hiding this forever.
That really is a theme throughout this discussion today, is how much secrecy and opacity is required for this stuff to move, especially at the rapid clip that it has, even incrementally. So that's
And
useful tool.
yeah, you have to ask, if you have to do something in secret, then it must not be good.
Exactly.
So they know. They know. I don't give them quarter. They know what they're doing is wrong, and they do it anyway.
Yeah. And they'll keep doing it until there's a reason that's big enough that scares them to stop. Well, thank you, Erin. I appreciate that. I'd like to move now to the explicitly legal arena and talk about not just lawsuits, but briefs that Kara Dansky has submitted, and maybe even ones that she's aware of. I'll let her take it where she will, to push back on bad laws, and not just legal policy, but internal organization policy, like, for example, the Wyoming sorority lawsuit that's going to be heard. Oral arguments are going to be heard in federal court here in Colorado next month. So, Kara, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much. Just before doing that, can I just say a quick few things about some of the topics you've touched on with the other
Yes,
panelists?
please.
Okay, so on schools, WDI USA's chapter has done a lot of work on exactly what Erin was just talking about in terms of obtaining documents from schools. For anyone who's not seen this stuff, it is absolutely shocking. It is so much worse than anyone could possibly imagine. It's on our website, womensdeclarationusa.com. A woman named Carol did a really deep dive into what's going on in Seattle schools and went to talk to the Seattle school board and really, really irritated them a lot. She's great. She's absolutely fantastic. And all of that information is up on our website too. Quickly on polling, WDI USA did some polling last fall, and it showed that 4 out of 5 American voters across the political spectrum, including voters who characterize themselves as, quote, liberal or, quote, very liberal, know that the phrase, a woman is an adult human female, is a true phrase. So I just want to second that everyone's with us here. Everyone's really with us here, which is another reason why we don't have to be afraid. Even though we all have been cowed into silence, we don't have to be. Everyone else is with us. And then I wanted to touch on your question, Ellen, about how do you talk to fellow Democrats. And one thing I really just try to keep saying over and over and over again is there is nothing progressive about trans. It is a regressive embrace of sex stereotypes. It is a sexist denial of the existence of women and girls as a sex class and an invasion of our spaces. It is a homophobic assault on uh, sexual orientation rights and the rights of same-sex attracted people. And it is the most authoritarian movement I have ever experienced in my entire life as a lifelong Democrat, in that no dissent is permitted. And Ellen is very familiar with, we recently covered a story that Ellen was involved in Colorado. And I tried to make the point in writing it up that within the Democratic Party, dissent is welcome on a whole range of topics. You're allowed to be a pro-gun Democrat. You're allowed to be an anti-Israel Democrat. You're allowed to be a Democrat who wants the Biden administration to place more restrictions on borders. I'm not saying my positions on any of those things. My point is just that dissent is permitted on any issue other than this one. And that makes this maybe the least progressive movement I've experienced in my lifetime. So I try to share that with fellow Democrats when talking about this. Okay, so I'll mention a couple Title IX cases, most of which WDI USA has filed briefs in, one of which we have not, and I'll explain why. But so I get asked a lot of times why we file these friend of the court briefs, because they seem really obscure and academic. But there's a reason why we do it, and that is because we think we're having an influence and we're making a difference in the federal judiciary. So the first case I want to talk about is called Adams versus St. Johns County. This came out of Florida. WDI USA did not file a friend of the court brief in that case because all the briefing was done before our organization launched. But Sharon's organization, Wolf, did. And the reason I know that is because in 2018, when I was serving on the board of Wolf, we filed a brief. This is a case where a female student wanted to access the boys' bathroom and the school said no. And so the female student sued. And the case made its way very slowly and painstakingly, ultimately up to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. So this is a case where the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, was being asked to decide if federal law permits single-sex bathrooms in schools? Now, that might be an astonishing question, but here we are. We're literally at a place where the federal judiciary is being asked to decide whether Title IX, the landmark civil rights legislation to protect women and girls in education, whether schools can allow single-sex bathrooms. And I'm very happy to say that the 11th Circuit ultimately ruled that schools may maintain single-sex bathrooms. Now, the natural question to come after that is, did the court rule that they must maintain single-sex bathrooms? And the answer to that question is sadly no, but I don't think the court had the authority to do that anyway, so I'm not super stressed about it. It's still a really solid ruling that schools are allowed to maintain single-sex bathrooms in those states. Now, the case did not and will not go before the Supreme Court, and I can explain why if anybody would like to know. But I just want to note that that case was not about sports. It was limited to bathrooms. However, a judge in the case issued a separate opinion saying that if sex means sex under Title IX for bathroom purposes, it also ought to mean sex for sports purposes. So that's really hopeful as well. Okay, so another case where WDI USA has filed a friend of the court brief is a case called BPJ versus West Virginia. West Virginia has a law on the books saying that schools within the state have to maintain single-sex sports. A young man named BPJ, who's being represented by the ACLU, full disclosure, my former employer, on a separate issue, challenged the law because he wants to compete on his school's girls cross-country team. Now, the district court in that case actually ultimately ruled in favor of the state mandating single-sex sports, which is great. But it was weird because that judge initially ruled in favor of BPJ, the young male student athlete. But then the judge reversed himself, and I've scoured the docket to get some inkling as to why this judge might have reversed himself, and I can't quite tell. But what I do know is that the judge in that case was appointed by President Clinton, and as far as I know, this is the only time a federal judge appointed by a Democratic president has ruled in favor of the material reality of sex and in favor of single-sex spaces in sports. So that's really good. That case is currently pending before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is where we filed our brief. And then the last case I want to talk about regarding Title IX is actually not about Title IX on its face, but it ultimately became about Title IX. So this is a case called Nice versus Becerra, and this is about whether medical providers who receive federal funding under the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, are allowed to discriminate against patients on the basis of their patients' gender identities. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, under Biden, has a rule in place that prohibits doctors from discriminating against patients on the basis of gender identity. And it became a class action because a lot of doctors are concerned about their ability to provide sex-specific medical care to their patients. One of the plaintiff doctors in this case has a male patient who may have prostate cancer, but when the doctor wanted to refer the male patient to an oncologist for testing, the patient refused. The patient basically said that because he identifies as a woman, he doesn't have a prostate and therefore cannot have prostate cancer. This man was literally willing to risk cancer in order to have his so-called gender identity validated by his doctor.
Kara, I'm sorry.
Now,
I just have to jump in and say, what?
Yeah.
That continue. Okay.
Yep, it's true. So the reason Title IX comes in is that when the Affordable Care Act was enacted in 2010, it incorporated Title IX's non-discrimination on the basis of sex provision into it. I have no idea why Congress did this in 2010, but it did. So what that means is that the lower court in this case ruled that, yes, in fact, doctors may be permitted to provide sex-specific medical care to their patients, including their patients who claim to have gender identities. And in doing so, the court necessarily also ruled that sex means actual sex under Title IX. So that's a really good ruling. It's now on appeal before the Fifth Circuit, where WDI USA has also filed a brief in support of the material reality of sex. I just want to say really quick, the Department of Health and Human Services currently states on its website that the Affordable Care Act prohibits discrimination in healthcare on the basis of so-called gender identity. This is simply not true. Now, lots of Americans can think lots of things about the Affordable Care Act. Some of us love it, some of us hate it, whatever. But whatever anyone thinks about it, it is undeniable that the law does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity. I know this because I have read it repeatedly. Obamacare was enacted and signed into law in 2010 before most people were even thinking about so-called gender identity. So for the Biden administration to state on its website that the law itself prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity is simply a blatant lie. Okay, so we filed a few briefs in other cases, as Ellen mentioned. One where a male university student was permitted to join a women-only sorority in violation of the sorority's own bylaws. That case is before the 10th Circuit, and oral arguments are upcoming in May. And there's another case where a state human rights commission has forced a female-only spa to admit men, regardless of the stage of quote-unquote transition. And that case is currently before the Ninth Circuit because the spa, to its credit, turned around and sued the Washington State Human Rights Commission. So we've got a brief before the Ninth Circuit in that case. And off topic, but really importantly, we've also filed a brief in a case called LW versus Scribetti. So this is coming out of Tennessee, which has a law banning puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones for minors, and a group of kids and their parents sued the state, claiming discrimination on the basis of their gender identity under Title IX. It eventually went before the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we got a great ruling from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals that ruled that sex is real. It ruled that, quote, transgender is not a coherent category for purposes of constitutional analysis. It's really an astonishing ruling, and I'm very happy about it. That case may make it to the Supreme Court because the ACLU has asked the court to review it, and we're still waiting to see whether the court's going to take the case. So I can give more details about those if you'd like, but I really wanted to focus on the Title IX cases for now.
That's very helpful, Kara. I do have a couple of follow-up questions for you because I think a lot of us on the call, or unless, I know there are some attorneys, but a lot of us on the call are more likely to be familiar with legislative processes versus federal courts. And so the case you were just talking about, LW versus Scrivetti, I think I have that right, that Sixth Circuit ruling, until it goes to the Supreme Court, is that ruling the law in the geographic area covered by the Sixth Circuit? Can you talk just a little bit about how that works?
Yep. So the Sixth Circuit includes, and just off the top of my head, I'm going to say Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan. I think I've got that right, but I could be wrong. I know it at least includes Tennessee because the case is out of Tennessee. The Sixth Circuit ruling in the Scrimetti case applies only in those states.
And it applies in those states. It holds as the law until the Supreme Court hears the case and either affirms it or elects not to hear the case, leaving it in place, or overrules it. Is that right?
Yes, but I should also say what the Sixth Circuit did is say that the Tennessee law banning puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones for minors is constitutional and satisfies Title IX. So the law is in place in all those states, but how the decision would affect a similar law in other states is not entirely clear.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. And then the other follow-up question I had for you was about the Wyoming sorority that forced this chapter to accept a young man as a member in their sorority against their bylaws. What motivated you to want to weigh in on a case that wasn't a question of, for example, violation of federal law or interpretation of federal law?
Because a handful of the sorority sisters sued their own sorority and they said, we do not want this man in our space. And we were like, right on. And we wanted to support those young women. They eventually sued anonymously and they attempted to proceed anonymously, but the judge said no. The judge made them reveal their names or drop their case. And they bravely stood up and they said their names out loud. And they said, we do not want this man in our sorority house. And so because WDI USA wants to stand up for the sex-based rights of women and girls in a wide variety of contexts, we were very happy to support them by filing a friend of the court brief in that case.
Thank you. That is a great answer. And I can't wait to meet those young women in Denver next month.
Yep.
It's going to be great. Thank you.
Wolf also filed a book. We also filed, the Women's Liberation Front also filed an amicus brief in that case. We tend to work a lot with WDI in very similar cases.
That's so great, Sharon. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Feminists got to stand up, right?
Yeah, you got to. You got to.
Yeah. And the parent groups file amicus briefs and other.
Oh yeah, Erin?
So, and we need these amicus briefs are really important, Kara. I think you should talk about how important they are because, first of all, they give extra information and factual information from women in your case for them to express what different hurdles that they're experiencing because of the transgender agenda. And it shows how widespread the issues are. And from the parent perspective, when we write our amicus briefs, it educates the judges because the majority of the parents in our briefs are Democrats. So it also disavows them of the right versus left, which I think is really important and something that these amicus briefs can help shine a light on, especially if the group is women who are Democrats, women who are lesbians, because these judges live in ivory towers and they hear the same kind of rhetoric that the politicians hear and say they don't know that gay people are against the transgender movement. They don't get it. They don't understand. They conflate the two. So it's really.
You think they don't get briefed by their staffs, Erin, potentially, correctly on that?
No, I don't.
Well, they get briefed by their clerks who have just come out of law school and have been totally indoctrinated.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah, no, Erin's completely right. The lawyers who represent actual parties to the litigation are quite limited in terms of what they can argue. They're limited to the topics of the narrow issues presented, the legal questions presented. They're expected to cite a lot of case law. Amicus, who are just weighing in often on legal issues. And so, of course, we cite case law, but we also have a tremendous amount of flexibility to make policy arguments and bring some of the, shine some light on some of the other issues that the judges may not be aware of. We have taken the opportunity to cite a lot of commentary from the US and the UK about the forced teaming issue, the forced teaming of the LGB with the TQI et cetera. We've talked a lot. We've brought in stuff from the international arena that U.S. judges would not have an opportunity to consider, especially in the Scrimetti case, where we talked about the human rights protections of the rights of the child under international law not to be harmed before puberty or during puberty, for that matter. So yeah, you can bring a lot of perspective as an amicus that you cannot if you're a lawyer for an actual party.
And you get to bring in the emotions. So
yeah,
detransitioners file amicus briefs. The parents file amicus briefs. So then you get to give the real world effect of how these rulings play out to the rank and file Americans who have to share bathrooms, sports teams, sororities with men who think that they're women.
Yeah, and I would also think that you're talking to a different audience with these briefs because you're talking to the court. Your audience is the judge, which is a different position and potentially a different temperament from an elected official. Can one of you talk about that a little bit?
I mean, it's an interesting question because at least at the federal level, federal judges have lifetime appointments and they're not supposed to be concerned with the kind of concerns that elected officials have. They're supposed to be completely unbiased and rule, in fairness and with an honest interpretation of the law. Having said that, judges are also human beings. And, a lot of us are aware that when an elected official makes a big deal about a particular trans issue or a gender identity issue, a lot of those elected officials have kids who are claiming to have a trans identity. I don't know anything about the kids of federal judges, but given everything we see in our society today, I'd be surprised if some of them don't have kids who are claiming a trans identity. So I think it goes both ways.
That seems like a reasonable hypothesis, Kara. Yeah, thank you. Erin, anything you want to contribute on that before I move along?
Well, if you speak in front of an audience and
Erin, I can't hear you, but you've muted yourself, so I'm going to say thank UB, Unyielding Bicyclist. So you talked very clearly about the forced teaming of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people with TQ plus and how that plays out in areas like conversion therapy and book content and anti-discrimination. Do you want to build on that and talk a bit about how to push back on that when you're dealing with laws that are already in place, UB?
Sure. I mean, well, if you're pushing back on the laws already in place, and I guess you're building, are you referring to like trying to get the law changed or bringing lawsuits or?
Well, I'm open to however you'd like to talk about that, because so much of the effort has to be split between interrupting additional harm being done through new legislation, but then also trying to address existing harm through legislation that's already been passed. And so I'll leave it open to you a bit to talk about what you think the most effective way is to engage on that. And if it's not a topic that is something that you really have a strong perspective on, that's okay too.
Well, I mean, of course, I think it's important to have these coalitions with gay people. I mean, I don't like to be an identitarian, but it's just really obvious in this case that it's influential. I mean, gays are not a voting bloc. Like, we're too small if you exclude all the people who call themselves gay and aren't really. So who are not on our side. So it's more about signaling, like kind of bringing your spokesperson on or whatever. So
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm saying like bribe your friends like me to be, make sure that you order the pizza with the right toppings that we like so that we come to the meetings. It's just totally silly, but like you got to be kind of identitarian on that point. Let me see.
What about, let me ask you a kind of a sideways but related question. One of the things we've talked about briefly in existing law is sanctuary states as a topic. And we talked about that as something that gets force teamed with issues like abortion to pass the legislation. But I know you have thought about and written about this topic. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Sanctuary states are a fascinating topic. So what this refers to, this category of laws, these are state laws that passed in the last several years. It's a trend. It's, they've been brought up in the context of abortion, as we spoke about, and immigration, but especially with so-called trans rights. And so these are state laws that govern how the state interacts with other states. And this is like a very tricky area in the law in general. And I think that the bills are being passed. A lot of them are kind of janky, and the sponsors of them are over-promising, even like to their own supporters and to people who might use the laws. Like, they're putting info out there, and I'm sure you'll be shocked by this, but they're putting information out there that's not accurate or will lead to problems. So those are the types
Blown my mind, UB, that never happens in this area of policy. Go ahead.
And this is one where I don't think that I think that is still a live issue in terms of like about a dozen states have passed them, but I think there's still some blue states that are considering them. And what you have to look at, I'm going to focus on one piece of those, which is the child custody piece. So one thing and these laws are not cookie cutter across states, like there's variations, but they generally say something about child custody. So for example, in a simple case, if there are divorced parents in Texas and one of them moves to California, just in general, there's a question of, okay, well, now that they're litigating child custody, which state court should they be going forward in? Should Texas be making decisions about the kid, or should California courts be making the decision? And what these sanctuary states do is they really disrupt the regime that's already out there. So historically, states were all about cooperation on family law because they know this is like, you want to minimize the conflict between parents or between custodians as much as possible. You don't want to encourage like these big expensive lawsuits. So the way they would ensure cooperation is that 49 states passed child custody laws, interstate child custody laws that are identical. So that means that if there's any kind of disagreement between the states, the judges literally call each other up and are like, well, let's resolve this. We're looking at the same statutory text, just with a different heading by our state, so we can work this out. And I say 49, the 50th state is Massachusetts, and its law is almost identical. It's just, so you really have like a 50-state regime here, where they are all carefully making sure that all their laws are the same. And the factors to be considered in terms of what state takes jurisdiction are kind of objective, like how long has the child been in the state, for example. So it's all about minimizing conflict. And what these new laws do, or they say they do, is that they...
I'm going to jump in 1 second, UB. Hey, Erin, can I ask you to mute your microphone? We've got some interference happening. Oh, thank you. Go ahead, UB.
Sorry
no
about
worries.
that.
Go ahead, UB.
Yeah, so these new sanctuary state laws are really, because what these sanctuary state laws say is that, hey, we're going to protect you if you have like a dispute between parents about whether the kid should receive gender medicine, come to our state and then you're safe. And, get away from that bad red state, like mom kidnap the kid from dad, whatever, and like come to our state and they're going to be safe. That's the branding, but that's not how it works out in practice because it's just causing a big mess. So I'll give you two examples which are different, California and New York. They went in kind of different directions with how they dealt with this area. So California is really aggressive, and they change their child custody law. So that law that's identical in all 50 states, it's not anymore in California. They say they were clarifying that law, but they're not. Of course, they totally changed it. So now, if you have a kid who's brought from Texas to California, and the judges call each other up and say, okay, which of us should take jurisdiction and rule on this matter, they will be coming to different conclusions because they are looking at different laws with different language. So this could lead to kind of chaos where you have court orders coming out of two different states and they're both following the law. And that leads to very, expensive litigation and kind of maybe even weird problems we haven't seen before. Like, it's just, you really shouldn't be messing with the child custody system like that. New York went in the opposite direction. New York, even though they talked a big game about the law, what they did was they acknowledged that this uniform law is across the 50 states. It's called the UCCJEA. They acknowledge that's real, and they just kind of yield to it. So even though they're calling themselves a sanctuary state and kind of acting as though you'll be safe if you move here, in fact, you can move here to get your kid the gender medicine, and then the Texas court says, no, I have custody, and the New York judge will also say, yeah, Texas has jurisdiction, not New York. So I think that the way that was branded was misleading. And so your takeaway from this is, if you're in a state that has not yet passed, if it is considering passing sanctuary state law, get family law experts or other legal experts to look at it just on the level, like on a really technical level, like just setting aside questions of gender medicine. Look at it and say, like, would this bill do what it says it's going to do? Will it cause chaos? Will it cause super expensive litigation within families? Because you might find out that it does not do those things. And then you could really pick off moderate or waffling legislators. They might be confused about gender medicine, but they know they don't want to pass this law that's just going to cause a giant mess.
Yeah, and beyond the expense and the mess of it, it creates uncertainty for the outcome for children, which I think most reasonable people would say is not a good outcome for messing with the law, don't you think?
Exactly. Family law is all about trying to minimize that up until the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's a weird situation of privileging ideology over best outcomes for the highest stake participant in the process. What about beyond, and you may not know a ton about this, but I'm curious, what about cities that identify as sanctuary cities on this particular topic? Like if Sacramento says, for the purposes of child custody, we are a sanctuary city, and they're within California, and then they have to deal with cross-state issues as well. Do you have anything you can talk about with that? I realize it's sort of a complicated situation.
Yeah, totally. I have not read those laws specifically, but I know local law in general. Localities have a lot less power than states and a lot less authority. And I would be even more skeptical about a city that's talking big about being a sanctuary city. Like, I would guess that they're not actually able to do very much.
Oh, that's interesting. So it could be just like more talk than action.
That is my guess.
Situation.
Yeah, I look out for that.
Okay, well, that's something reassuring in this conversation, which there hasn't been a ton of. So thank you, UB. Anything else you want to add before I move on to the final speaker?
Oh, no, thank you.
Well, can I just jump in? Can I jump in there just about the trans sanctuary cities?
Please.
I think that what will happen there is that the local jurisdiction will then be that city. So if a child is from a more conservative area of the state, let's say Orange County, and goes to Sacramento, they're going to then basically be forum shopping and get a more liberal judge, and that hearing could then be in Sacramento as opposed to a more conservative area in Orange County. So that's what I think is going to be the outcome of those types of laws.
Erin, that's worrying because that
But
creates incentives for bad actor parents.
Yes, and it's part of the whole agenda is to get these kids away from their non-supporting parents or their non-affirming parents, and to basically emancipate these kids. And by then putting them in another county or another city, that's creating both a legal divide and a physical divide between the parents. And some parents will have a difficult time traveling to another county or another part of the state to try to fight for their child.
Which could be part of the intention of doing that in the first place on the part of the other.
It absolutely is. I mean, you take somebody from Oklahoma and they have to fight a custody battle in California when, first of all, you can't find an attorney in California who will take your case, let alone the expense of flying back and forth. And those of us who are litigators, we know that you can show up for a hearing and the judge can just give you 2 minutes and kick it, another month forward, and you're flying back out. So it's by design.
That seems punitive. It really does. Thank you, thank you, Erin, for contributing that. Yubi, anything else before I move on to our final speaker to talk about dealing with laws that have already passed?
Oh no, please move on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. That was really interesting. Amy, I'm going to come over to you to bring us home. I know we talked about how to recognize the manipulation tactics and then be effective in pushing back on existing legislation. Is there anything you want to talk about to follow up on that in the arena of pushing back on legislation that's already passed? Anything you want to talk about from your perspective?
Gosh, I'm not sure about what to say around that. I think, a lot of what we do when we do actions, in front of things, actions that, like Kara and I organized an action in front of the White House. I've organized actions at the NCAAs. I think that there are things that we can do in terms of making the problems of those policies visible and taking actions against them, trying to really build publicity around those actions and trying to, get them touched by the media. I held an event in my town in support rather of a woman who was banned by the YMCA. The YMCA said that they were following their policy and that, she was doing wrong by calling out a man who was touching young girls in the women's locker room. She, of course, was following her instincts as a woman to keep young girls safe, but they were simply following the policy. We held a press conference in the town. It ended up getting a lot of press, including legacy media press. So really doing the work to make the problem of these policies visible. And I think that is where these actions come into play. I think that is where our voices on social media come into play. I think that, people were very up in arms, for example, just by the fact of Dylan Mulvaney getting a tampon ad, for example. But women speaking out against those things makes it visible, or showing up at sports events where boys are racing. We did an action here in my state where we showed up at the state finals for track and field. We did some chalking. We had posters. We had informational things for parents. The policy that they were following, allowing this boy to compete as a girl, that is part of Washington state law. But our being there provoked a lot of reaction. We got a lot of parents involved. We had really 90% support, and especially it was I felt really useful to the girls who were seeing us push back. So it was useful for the parents to gain information, but it was useful to the other runners. And this was a state championship. So there were, busloads of girls from all kinds of schools who were witnessing adults saying no to this ideology. I think, a lot of these kids are ultimately demoralized because these are the policies that they're seeing in the school. But I think public intervention, actions, social media, using our voices as best we can. As the saying go, courage calls to courage. And the more visibility we have speaking out our dissent, I do think the more that people will get involved.
I'm so glad you highlighted that, Amy, because you make a number of good points there. Committees in the state legislature, regardless of the ideology or bent of the local newspaper, are probably not that interesting to cover. But an action outside the YMCA or an action at the track meet gives an opportunity for something interesting and media friendly to occur that could get coverage and reach people that wouldn't otherwise be reached. That's really interesting. And at the meet, when you were talking about these busloads of athletes, in addition to providing some heart to them that there were adults standing up for rationality and reality for them, did you talk to any of those students individually about this?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a number of students, actually boys and girl runners, coming up thanking us for being there, and many of them, they were wanted to tell us their experience. As much as we were, there to provide information, they really wanted to share their experience of how it feels. And a lot of, of course, the girls were very frustrated by the boy running against them. It's very demoralizing. They wanted to share how angry they were. They wanted to express how they felt about it. This particular boy, we were told, does a lot of kind of basically shit talking while he's running, telling the girls, there's no way you can catch up to me. So that also was demoralizing for them. But, it's also interesting to have the young men come up and speak to us, and they, them saying they also don't agree. They don't like it either. They don't think it's fair for the girls. And I thought that was, I know that there's so many young men who don't agree with these policies, but it was also just very sweetly heartening how much they cared about, the women on their team, the young women who were on their team, and standing up for them.
Yeah, that is really heartening. Did any of the young women talk to you about any guidance they'd received that they should just refuse to compete under these circumstances? Did that come up at all?
No one mentioned that. So I don't, none of the young women happened to mention that. I don't think, I didn't get the sense that, the young women that we happened to be speaking to were, particularly savvy on even the arguments that we were stating and had on our signs. I don't think they were particularly educated on Title IX. I don't think they particularly knew about it. But this question, of course, that you present comes up all the time. Why don't these girls just stop competing? And I think there's a couple of good responses to that, which is, first of all, this is not really a sports issue, and it's not just a sex-based rights issue. This is really a reality versus anti-reality issue. As Aaron said, this is an attack on our free speech, and this ultimately affects all of us. Sometimes, especially men, I've seen, say this thing that women should just stop competing. And, we can't really place the onus on teenage girls. I mean, yeah, would it be kind of cool and an interesting story, and maybe the media would cover it if every single girl refused to compete? That would be wonderful. But why are we adults placing the onus on teenage girls to keep themselves safe. It's really for adults to stand up, put boundaries in place, say no, we won't allow this to happen to our daughters, and also to encourage everyone. This is an issue that goes far beyond sports. This is an issue that is attacking all of our ability to speak the truth in public, and to protect the truth in language and law.
Yeah, talk about standing up for those young women and setting a good example of what adult behavior looks like. That's great, Amy. Thank you so much. We are now almost at time. I'm going to just quickly ask, and I'm not going to go around. I'm just going to ask all of the panelists, all 5 of you, to come in with concluding remarks. Meanwhile, if folks have questions, you can get in the queue to be a speaker. We are going to be really short on time for questions, and in fact, our panelists may have to leave at the top of the hour. So if you do, no hard feelings. But we'll try to get a couple of questions in if we can. But first, let's go to concluding remarks. So all 5 of you, if you could please, anything you think is important as we wrap this topic up, because we've covered a lot of ground. And I'm just going to throw it open to you now and go ahead.
All right, I'm going to start if that's okay. I just want to say, echo 1,000% everything Amy just said, right? Like, we need to be out supporting women who are standing up and girls who are standing up. And I too have heard the calls for boycott the girls sporting events. And I don't think people realize how young girl athletes might have worked really almost their entire lives to get to that place, right? To be able to do that competition. There's prize money, there's scholarships with it. And then just to tell them to stand down because some guy decided he wanted to get in the race and no official, would do the right thing. I don't think it's very fair to those girls, right? And all the work that they've done. We really need to push back on the lawmakers. We really need to stand strong with those girls. And I've seen some of the protests. I know Kara's been at some of them, really trying to make that point and been run off the field, right? I mean, we are like in this upside down endarkenment right now. I don't know why. I don't know where this is coming from, but as much as we can push back on it and encourage everyone to stand back, the emperor truly has no clothes and we all see it, right? So like, say more of that. So I just wanted to back Amy up on that because I do think that is the way to go. And I think the more people, write letters to the editor in your local paper too. That is the most read section of any news media is the letters to the editor section. So, a lot of times your fellow citizens want to know what you're thinking. And when you tell them, it gives them air cover to say, you know what, I knew this was wrong, and I didn't agree with this either, right? So the more of us speaking, the more we're going to get out from this cowering of fear, which is just crazy, and be able to turn this back. And thanks everybody for coming tonight. That was actually a very, very cool space. Thank you very much, DIAG, for putting it together for us.
Yeah, thanks, DIAG. Thanks, Sharon. Okay, who else wants to have a closing remark? It looks like Kara has her mic on. Go, Kara.
Sure. So people ask me sort of what's going to happen and do I have any hope for the Democrats? And someone commented on a Twitter thread today that I, quote, actively work to get Republicans elected. And I was really irritated because that is not at all what I'm doing. Going back to what Sharon said about the Democrats who have voted in alignment with women's sex-based rights and to protect kids at the state level, I 100% agree that we need to give them cover and we need to encourage more. So do I have hope for the Democrats in charge in Washington? Not so much. I don't think they're going to change course. I don't think Biden can at this point. If Nancy Pelosi comes out and says something for women's sex-based rights, I will be shocked and thrilled. But there's a lot that can be done at the state level. And Democrats are starting to see this. And so get out there and ask the questions. Ask questions of your state lawmakers, of candidates, of challengers, of Democrats who are challenging incumbent Dems. Get them on the record saying they will vote with us. And then, of course, I'm not trying to get Republicans elected. What I want is Democrats in office who will protect the sex-based rights of women and girls and to protect kids. That's it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kara. Okay, Amy, you've got a closing remark. Over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to just say 2 things. One, I just wanted to say that there are so many places if people do want to testify sort of in person that you can go. I think some people don't know that you can Zoom in and testify for a lot of these bills or to school board meetings or even to your own city council. So you don't have to leave your home in order to testify for some of these things. And also many states and many school boards allow people from out of state to give testimony. So you can often, if you know about bills that are coming up, if you follow organizations like WDI or Our Duty or Wolf, you can find legislation that is happening outside of your state and zoom in and give testimony. And of course, as Erin always says, you can simply call your legislatures as well. But I just want to offer that to people, that you don't have to have a child at a school, and you don't necessarily even have to be in state to put in your voice and to get it on public record. Really, this is about it is about how we affect law, but it's also creating a public record of dissent. All of these testimonies that happen at school board meetings or city councils or in the state legislature are recorded. So to get your voice on recording, where people may or may not watch it later, but it is on testimony and record, this is creating a record of everyone who has dissented, and anyone who is a Democrat who is going to testify. It's great to start off with that and just mention that you're a Democrat, because it really disrupts the narrative that it is only, yes, right-wing religious people who are pushing back on this. And the other thing I want to say about that, how they have kind of bifurcated this, the propaganda around this in the media, as that if you are pushing back against this, you are a right-wing Christian, and that if you partner with Republicans on this issue, then you have somehow corrupted your own values. And I just always like to say, because this is such a reality versus anti-reality idea, either you understand that sex is real or you don't. And if we were, if somehow flat earthers took over and we're building a movement and we're trying to change laws that impacted our safeguarding procedures, for me to stand with anyone and say the earth is round, it wouldn't mean that we've somehow, we're somehow value-based together on things. It just means that we both understand reality. If myself and a serial killer both understand the earth is round, it doesn't make me and the serial killer on the same team. It just means we're two people who happen to understand that reality exists. So I do think that we need to work across party lines on this issue. And first of all, obviously there's so many people who are Republican and Christians who are amazing people who I have just when I have done work on this, we shouldn't devalue these people also, but also just to say it doesn't mean that we have shifted our other values. People with very vastly different values can stand side by side and understand that the reality of sex exists.
Well said, Amy. Thank you. I'm going to pull UB in, and then I'll go over to Erin. UB, any concluding remarks from you?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that our opposition and the average trans ally who you're arguing with in real life, or maybe a legislator who thinks they support trans rights, they're very ignorant. They don't know really basic concepts. And if you have, whoever's on this call, if you have spent just a couple hours going down a rabbit hole, if you have just listened to the talk tonight, then you are so much more educated and informed than your interlocutors. And so just a reminder when you're out there in public to break things down, super basic, small words, no jargon. People will not know what gender identity is. I have argued with gay people who think they are experts on the topic of trans rights, and they think that, and when I say I don't believe in gender identity, they're like, neither do I. So just keep that in mind in your testimonies and in your everyday turfing.
Everyday turfing. Thank you, UB. Erin, bring us home.
Okay, so, being a true litigator, I just wanted to say that don't be afraid to hold your ground. I was sent a request to talk a little bit about compelled speech. We had an event at a public library in Davis 8 months ago, where the librarian told us we were not to misgender anyone. We were not to talk about males playing in female sports. So of course we did. And we were taught Yeah, and we were tossed out of the library. And even some of the speakers, and I love them all, but we're like, well, maybe we can change our language this way. No, you don't change your language. You stick to the truth. And we warned the library that we would sue them, and we did. And we entered into a settlement where we're all getting a nice little amount of money. But more importantly, the library had to change its policy for its public spaces. So this is we win these.
Well
We
done.
have to
Yeah.
not. Yeah, we win these, and so we have to keep moving forward and not be afraid. Because despite the fact that a lot of courts are now tainted, um, the courts are where this is ultimately going to be decided. Unfortunately, this will have to get, as Kara talked about, have to get up to the Supremes. They are going to have to decide, are we a sexually dimorphic species? Are we female and are we male? And can we change? It's going to ultimately be in their hands. But I would be remiss if I didn't end this conversation with people taking a look at our protectkidsca.com website, which is our ballot initiative in California. If you are a California resident, you can download the petition and sign it, send it in. We need the signatures mailed by May 15th to get them to count. If you are not a California resident, go ahead and look at our website anyway. Maybe you'll get some ideas. Maybe you'll be able to donate and help us change California. Because I'll tell you, if we take down a really big blue state, if Colorado, Washington, New York, or California returns to gender reality, the rest of the nation will fall. The Republicans are smartly, very astutely going after the low-hanging fruit, going to the red states and getting those laws passed. But nothing ends in our country until the blue states return to reality. We talked about these trans sanctuary states. That means anyone in a red state who has a prohibition on gender interventions on children, all they need to do is to get into a blue state. And so it doesn't end. So we have to keep marching forward. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated this space. It's such an honor to be with such brilliant women.
Isn't it such a good
And men,
group?
I haven't heard any yet. But
Thank you
yeah,
so much. Are there any, before
incredible.
I take, we're over time, so I'm just going to take one question. But before I do that, are there any other resources that the panelists want to make sure they plug like Erin just did? I should have asked y'all that.
Yes, please buy my book, The Reckoning: How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls.
Amen. I've read it. It's great.
Thanks, Ellen.
And don't forget to visit the Women's Liberation Front website, get on our email list. We follow a lot of legislation and we'll tell you what stuff to advocate for and when it's coming up and, how you can get organized as well.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay.
And please sign the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Thanks.
Yes, that's good too. Thank you. All right, let's do one question and then we will wrap this up because we're over time. I see we have Val here as a speaker. Val, I'm going to ask you to take yourself off off mute and ask a question of the panel, and welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful space. My question is kind of simple, and hopefully maybe someone at some point can get in more detail
You may
on
have
this
to promote
question.
her up to a speaker, I think.
Oh, she's a speaker. I can hear her. You can't hear her, Sharon?
Nope.
Oh, yeah, there have been a few things where one speaker couldn't hear another tonight. I'm sorry that's happening. I'll try to repeat what Val says after she asks her question. So go ahead, Val.
So my question is, and what I've been kind of struggling with over this legislative session, is specifically PTA advocating on bills that are anti-family, not protecting kids, keeping secrets from parents. So how do we as parents not only educate, because PTA is huge all over the nation, how do we educate other parents and how do we fight back against that?
Thank you, Val. I'm going to repeat your question so that Sharon and any of the other speakers can hear it. So Val was saying during this session, one of the things that she has found is a struggle for her, seeing the PTA involvement in advocating for these bad bills, and what can parents do to either educate or otherwise influence PTA to take a more realistic stance on this. And I will open it up to speakers to respond. You don't need to raise your hand; just take yourself off mute.
Take over the PTA, become a member, be that voice. Look, the PTA is tied to the teachers union. And the only way to break through is to become a leader. One of the ways that the institutions got captured is people took jobs, these ideologues took these positions that nobody wants. Nobody wants to be the lead volunteer of the PTA. It's a non-paying job and a thankless job. No one wants to be on a school board. They know this. No one wants to be the teacher that reads the new textbooks. These are the positions that the gender ideologues took willingly because they could too, because most of them didn't have children. And so they had the time, and they took these difficult, thankless jobs in order to change the agenda. And so they need to be recaptured by people who are gender critical and have the best interest of women and children in mind.
That is great advice, Erin. And people who are gender critical and have the best interests of children and women in mind, that's a good motivation to take these thankless jobs. You know, it can make a thankless job a lot more rewarding. So that makes a ton of sense. So Val, I see you're here still. I think Erin's advice to you is you have to take over the PTA. So we'll be waiting for you to do that. Thank you. Okay, Amy, did you take yourself off mute?
Oh,
Did you want to
nope.
chime in?
That was an accident.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you for this space.
Thanks for being here. So thanks to everyone for joining. What a good discussion with some superstars. So thank you everyone for this. It was just fascinating, even just for me as the moderator. DIAG, anything you want to share with the group before we close out the space for the night?
No, I we certainly appreciate everybody taking their time. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions. Usually we wrap up in an hour, but there's just really too much to cover here. We'll be promoting our next space in this series in the next couple of weeks. That'll be about legislation that we're hoping will be get bipartisan support, get some blue states, get some Democratic legislators to pick up legislation and support it. So our next space will cover that. What's coming next? What's the next wave of legislation that will be promoted?
That's great. I can't wait for that. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great night and get out there and do what you can. Good night.